Welcome to The Keys to Your Legacy with your host, Elijah Keys. In each episode, Elijah will have a conversation with other professionals to discuss how their fields relate to trust and estate planning. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, keyslawgroup.com. Now here's the host of The Keys to Your Legacy, Elijah Keys.
Hi, thank you so much for tuning in to our newest episode of The Keys to Your Legacy. I am estate planning attorney Elijah Keys. I am joined by Vern Adkins, a longtime friend of mine from Hopkins Carley. Vern, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you, Elijah?
Today is a good day. It's been a while since we've talked, but I'm really glad that we get to touch base and say hi.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, Vern, you have kind of an interesting career that started not with trusts, but with banking. Tell us about how that started out.
Yeah, I actually got started even before that. My first job out of law school was with a major consulting firm in their tax practice. And so I was working on venture capital compliance and hedge funds and stuff like that. And then I went into the trust administration side with a bank. And so for about 7 years, I worked as a trust officer for a boutique private bank. And it's been about the last 7 years that I've been as a full practicing attorney.
Yeah, it's quite a shift. I remember right after law school interviewing with a couple of different CPA firms. I think WTAS, that is now Anderson Tax, right?
Yep.
And I interviewed with Deloitte as well. And I remember interviewing at Deloitte and the hiring partner saying, we'll bring you right in on the CPA track because you're already an attorney. You don't need to do any tests or audit. And I asked her about the timeline. How many hours do you have to do? And she said, it's not so bad. You only have to do 60 hours a week when we're not in tax season. Is that your experience?
It was all consuming. And that's what pushed me out from that type of job. You look at the people that are in front of you in the food chain, right? And you kind of see like, do I want my life to look like that manager or that director or that partner? And I said, absolutely not. They're always on. They have no work-life balance whatsoever. And I think it's better now than it was. I mean, this was now like 15 years ago. But at that time, it was just I didn't want that. And banking seemed like a much more reasonable work-life balance, banker's hours and all that. So that was a big driver for me in switching.
So a trust officer.
Yep.
So explain to everyone what a trust officer is, because a lot of our viewers might not understand that term.
Yeah, so a lot of people, at least historically, would think of a bank as somebody that could act as a trustee of your trust, or they could settle your estate when you pass away. And for a long time, that was very true. And a lot of banks had a separate department, and that was their function, to act as trustee for their clients' trusts, to settle their clients' estates and things like that. And the person at the bank that does that is known as a trust officer. And so really, sort of in the context of what you and I do more, we see this now as more like the private fiduciary, right? Where they're a person whose sole job is just to administer trust or settle estates. And so that's what I did for 7 years. I had a defined set of accounts, and I got to know the trust documents really well, got to know the families really well, and just powered through those in sort of that narrow scope where you just become very specialized for those particular trusts that you have.
Yeah. But a lot of people might not consider why they would need that type of role. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we have other things to talk about, but help your viewers and my viewers understand why someone might need a bank or a private trustee to take care of things.
Yeah, so when it comes to needing a bank, there's truly only one circumstance when you need one. And that's if you have the situation where you've got a non-citizen spouse, and you have to have a qualified domestic trust. If you want to get a marital deduction on the first death, you have to set up the special kind of trust. And the tax code actually has it baked right into it that if the value of that trust exceeds $2 million, you basically have to have a corporate trustee. You can't have an individual. If you do have an individual, there's these bonding requirements that are virtually impossible to meet. So that's the only scenario when you need one. Now, when some people want one on the corporate side, maybe they've got a really long-standing relationship with a corporate trustee, and they've gotten to know the trust folks there over a period of time, and they just feel comfortable and want that kind of relationship. Short of that, it's really this scenario when you might either want a corporate trustee or a licensed private fiduciary. And for folks in that situation, there's any number of factors. It could be I don't have any family member that can handle it for me. So I just need somebody else that can do it. You know, circumstances like that where you just need a professional to come in. And then as between a private fiduciary individual versus a corporate trustee, it just comes down to the sophistication level that you need, what your long range plan is. And the lines are just getting blurred. I don't know if you've seen this in your practice, but a lot of private fiduciaries are sort of wisely teaming up together. And that was always one of the concerns about a private fiduciary is, well, I like this person now, but I don't need them for like 30 years. So how do I know that person's going to be around? And now they're starting to form firms and so forth. So you can say, I want to name this private fiduciary firm because I know they're going to be around in 30 years.
Yep. I had that situation actually last week where I had a client who wanted a professional fiduciary, and I named this fiduciary, and he called me and said, I'm retiring. I don't want to be part of this. And so I listed all the fiduciaries that have been named in the document, and 3 out of 4 were no longer practicing. Of course, you and I, we've been around 15, 16 years, right? And so those fiduciaries are just gone. There's one thing that I wanted to clarify. A lot of our viewers are not attorneys or CPAs, or not professionals. So I wanted to kind of clarify something you said. You mentioned something about a marital deduction. Assets can transfer between spouses freely before death and after death. There's one exception, and that's something that Vern talked about. If someone is not a citizen and they're receiving money directly from a spouse, but that person doesn't want to be deemed as leaving the country in order to maintain that marital deduction, that they need a special trust to hold those assets. It's called a qualified domestic trust. And if that trust holds more, as Vern mentioned, it holds more than $2 million, then you're required to have a corporate trustee. And as Vern said, that's right in the tax code. So that transitions right to the next topic. Are you fundamentally an estate attorney? Are you fundamentally a tax attorney? Or what?
Yeah, we like to blur that line. Our department here at Hopkins and Carley is not called the estate planning department. We call ourselves the family wealth and tax planning department. So,
Yep.
Where our firm really shines is when we're doing actual tax planning, right? If somebody walks in off the street and says, hey, I need a basic revocable trust and a will, I'm capable of drafting that, but most of the time we're not adding a lot of value there. So the folks that we tend to work with tend to be, hey, I've got a taxable estate and we need to do some planning to reduce that estate tax number.
So when you're talking about taxable estate, there's an estate tax exemption, meaning that an amount that someone can give away without paying any tax when they die or during their life. Currently, it's set at $13.61 million, if I'm correct. Is that right?
Yep, per person. So 27.2 million for a married couple, which is
That's right.
mind-boggling to the average person in flyover country. But for California and the Bay Area, that's not such an outrageous number.
Might not be. But then that number is going to reduce, right? Or it's set to reduce depending on what Congress does. It's going to reduce to 5 million plus inflation. People ask me what I think it'll be. I estimate maybe around 7, somewhere around there.
Between 7 to 7.5. It really depends what happens with the inflation number this year. It seems to be trending down. So yeah, somewhere between 7 and 7.5 per person. So 14 to 15 for a married couple.
Right. Well, I noticed here that you talk about how should high net worth individuals think about significant lifetime transfers. So there's a cliff coming. Talk about that.
Yeah, so under current law, if Congress does nothing, and I think everybody can appreciate that Congress is really good at not passing laws and not doing anything. So the default, if they just sit on their hands, is in 2026, the exemption goes down like that. So a lot of people are starting to think, well, that's a lot of exemption I could be losing. I need to do something to use that exemption before it goes away. And so you're not getting a ton of traction directly with clients on this, but you're starting to see some stories percolating in the popular press. Yep. CNBC had something a couple weeks ago. The Wall Street Journal had something. So people are starting to wake up to the fact that, oh, when those Trump tax cuts go away, there's some big tax changes coming. So what should I do about that? And so you're kind of getting this interesting scenario where people are just starting to ask that question, like, what should I do? And of course, that what they should do depends a lot on their circumstances.
Yep.
So in broad strokes, we're talking about a $27.2 million exemption now going down to say 15 million for married couples, going down to about 15 million. So the first reaction of people is, I want to use that portion that's going away. Let me use up the half that's going to go away. And the tax law just doesn't let you do that. Basically, you have to use it or lose it. So if you can't find a way to use up more than the amount that's going away, you're losing some of that exemption.
Right.
And that's really bothersome to some people, right? The thought of, I've got all this exemption now and I'm going to lose it. I need to do something to take advantage of it. So for the client that's worth $100 million, married couple of kids, it's easy, right? We're going to take $27.2 million of stuff, throw it into a generation skipping dynasty trust or something like that, use up that exemption and you're done with it. It's really quite simple. For the clients that have less than a $15 million estate and they're going to stay in that range, also a no-brainer. You don't need to do anything. You're going to be under the exemption in any case. You're fine. For the clients in the middle, it's really tricky though. What do you do with that client who's worth $30 million? And we've got like piles of these people and they come in, I'm worth $30 million. I'm just barely taxable right now. What can I do? And for people like this, they're really getting steered in kind of the wrong direction, in my humble opinion, from people that don't really fully appreciate what they're talking about. So this is where you're starting to see a lot of people pushing things like SLATs, a spousal lifetime access trust.
Yes.
Meaning I can just take my exemption and give it to my spouse and not change my life in any way, shape, or form other than I executed a legal document that says I've given assets to my spouse in a special kind of a trust. And therefore I've used up my exemption. Or both spouses do it for one another and they give each other their money.
Isn't that reciprocal trust violation?
There's that aspect. So you can kind of draft around that by putting slightly different features in the trust there. But at the end of the day, our firm does not do that. We just have a blanket policy. We will not do SLATs.
Okay.
But they're really getting pushed by a lot of advisors because it seems just amazing, right? I can sign this piece of paper and just lock in my exemptions. But we feel it's in the too good to be true category. And our rationale for this is there's really been no economic substance change here. And so at the end of the day, we feel that this is something that, doesn't work as we sit here today in 2024. Probably, but that's mostly because one, the exemptions are high, so it probably doesn't matter for most of the people that are doing these. Two, the IRS is super underfunded, right? So they just can't chase after people that are doing these things. And then third, the courts are really taxpayer friendly right now. All of this can change, and the law just really doesn't support this kind of unsubstantiated transaction. So our view is that ultimately these things are going to wind up just being like tax shelters in the 1980s. And I know this kind of predates both me and you, Elijah, but I'm sure you've heard the stories too about in the 1980s, people would set up these leasing companies and take these crazy depreciation deductions and never pay any income tax for the entire decade of the 1980s. And now the advisors are in jail or they've paid huge fines and all this kind of stuff, right? These things fall apart when there's no economic substance to it. So that's our view on the SLAT. So we view that as too aggressive. And so the question then is, what do I do, right? If I'm that $30 million person, these exemptions are going away, what do I do? And bottom line is you're going to lose it. And there's nothing you can do about it. Unless you're willing to part with the majority of your assets right now, just to save taxes, there's not a ton you can do. So that really kind of...
It's not worth it. It's not worth giving away everything to save some of it.
Well, and that's what drives the conversation is like trying to drill down to, hey, client, like what's your real focus here? Like this title of your podcast, the keys to your legacy, and just thinking about legacy, there's more to your legacy than just minimizing the transfer taxes on the inheritance you leave to your heirs at the bottom line. And so you really have to drive that question. Is the only reason you're doing a gift right now just to save taxes? And if you didn't have to do it to save taxes, would you still do it at the end of the day? And so that's something that I like to have a pretty deep conversation with my clients about is, why are you doing this?
Yep.
Is it just to save taxes? And is that really the most important thing to you? Have you thought about the other factors? Like, what are you going to live on? What is your life going to look like? What kind of life do you want to give to your kids? Have you thought about that whole big picture before you just jump headfirst into, I need to give everything away to get this good tax advantage?
Right. That's a big issue because, you could certainly take steps to lower the value of the assets, right? That's a big part of it, but giving everything away is the safest route, right? You just gift it. Is there a possibility that people could take steps to reduce the value of what they own versus give it away?
Yeah, there's all kinds of things people can do in terms of, the big one that we see in our world is fractionalizing assets, right? If I have a house and I sell it, I get 100% of that value. If I try and sell 50% of my house, someone's not going to pay me 50% of the full value. They're going to pay me something less than that because they have to deal with me as a co-owner, right? And so
Right.
you get a discount on your value there. And so you can take advantage of that in terms of maybe you don't want to give the whole rental property away, but maybe you give a 25% interest away or a 50% interest in the rental property away. And so now you've made somewhat of a gift. It's not going to be enough to change the estate tax result, but now what's left for you is something that we can take a discount on. And we certainly do that kind of transaction.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned in your description of the estate tax a lot about tax planning and tax prospectus and tax advisory. You certainly can't do all of that yourself. You probably have to involve other individuals, other professionals in that role, such as, for example, if someone has a business, how much of that business can you give away because you have income, you have investments, you have deductions, you have an entire life here. It's not just a number on a page, it's a whole living person. How do you make sure that they're okay?
Yeah, so we love taking a team approach on this kind of stuff. I'm pretty handy, I would say, when it comes to Excel, and I can put together those projection spreadsheets. And here's what your income would look like in this scenario or that scenario. But I much rather have that person's CPA or financial advisor involved in that process. And so we can find one who's got the best access to information, who's closest to the client to get the kind of data that you need to do a spreadsheet like that. But then also, too, who can do that most cost effectively? If you have a high-end financial advisor, they might be able to do these projections for you essentially as part of their management fee and not
Right.
charge an hourly rate for that kind of work. So yeah, let's push that down to that person that can do that work rather than having the attorney at the highest billing rate being the one creating an Excel spreadsheet.
Yep.
But yeah, team approach is the only way to go with this kind of stuff.
Yeah. How often, with clients who are not high net worth, how often are you working with their CPAs and financial advisors on preparing a plan?
I would say almost all of my practice is high net worth people. And so anytime we're doing a transfer transaction, gifting transaction, anything like that, we always try and bring the CPA in, really for no other reason than to try and push tasks off to them. I love doing gift tax returns. I'm pretty good at them, but the CPA can probably do it for half the cost if they have experience with it. So if we can push that off to the CPA, great. If we're setting up entities for them, a family limited partnership or an LLC or something, CPA's got to know that because they're going to be the ones doing the income tax returns
Yep.
for that. So the sooner we get everybody involved in that process, the better it is, because when you get that good cohesive team of advisors, they spot issues from different perspectives, right? That
Yep.
CPA might have knowledge about something that you as the attorney don't, or maybe the client didn't appreciate that this factor is really important. The CPA does, and they can raise that issue.
I had an issue like that actually last month when I met with a client who was high net worth, and he had a real estate business, or he had a commercial business held in an S corporation. And of course, asset in an S corporation doesn't get a stepped up basis when he dies, so it costs a whole bunch of capital gain. So I was ready to defund the S corp, but I consulted with the CPA, and the CPA explained you can't do that yet. We need to hold it in that S corp for at least 3 years because of if you convert from a C corp to an S corp, then you have to maintain the S corp status for a period of time, otherwise you pay a bunch of tax. So that's what they're going to do. Okay.
Yeah, S corporations are downright scary when it comes to estate planning for
Yep.
so many reasons, so many easy ways to trip over unintended rules there that you really got to have some allies there that can help guide you through that process.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've created corporations, but I certainly don't do anything after that. No. Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that there's a lot of different tools and a lot of different ways that people can proceed. How do you guide people then towards the right avenue? I mean, how do you help direct them? Because someone who's high net worth has a particular frame of mind that tends to be fairly aggressive. They want to know the answer. They want to make a decision. They want to move forward. How do you guide people along this kind of long, deliberate process?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think a lot of people have a one size fits all mindset when it comes to the high net worth client. And they just like the person you just described is the startup CEO, like the founder of a startup type
Right.
personality.
Right.
That's that person that is, give me the information, give me the facts, let me make a decision, go. But that's not the whole gamut of people.
Right.
We get a lot of people in the Bay Area, and I'm sure you see these folks too, where grandpa bought some real estate in San Jose in 1957, and that turned out to be a really good idea. And his only real skill in life was he didn't sell, right? And he just sat there and collected money and got good leases and so forth. And that person has just as much money as that 25-year-old startup founder, in Sunnyvale, right? And so you get kind of that whole gamut, right? And then you get the people that maybe it's the second generation. Maybe they inherited a bunch of funds from another generation, and that's where they got their money from. Or you get the professionals, right? They're the people that worked for the big firms in the 90s and early 2000s. They were getting interest in their firm's venture capital arm, right? Some of these larger firms, it's not well advertised, but a lot of these firms, they would have like a venture capital fund that would invest alongside with their VC clients. And so all the partners at these firms were getting all these interests in all these startup companies and IPOs and everything. And so they make crazy amounts of money. So you get that kind of person too, who has a lot of money, totally different mindset from the CEO type.
Right.
You get all these people coming into it, and you really have to pause and kind of back up. The old style of this, like the people that I worked with when I first started doing this and have now since retired, they came in with a very one-track mind. All of my clients, the only thing they care about is saving taxes. So we're going to just push them right down this path to what do they have to do to save the most possible tax. We're not going to ask any questions about what their family wants, what their passions are, what they really care about. We're just going to save them some tax.
Yeah.
That's just not the right answer, because on the back end, I've seen a lot of the fallout from this. When you get families pushed down that path, and then it turns out that actually they had a bunch of charitable intent. They didn't want to leave that much to the kids. They wanted to do these philanthropic ventures. Or maybe the kids have no interest in running the family business, right? And mom and dad are just sure that they're going to want that. And so they're going to cram that down there. So it's really starting with just having a conversation with the clients about what are your goals?
Yep.
And a lot of times it shocks clients when this is one of the first questions I ask them, because they come into this thing thinking the only thing that matters is taxes. And then I start to ask them about other things, and it gets them to start thinking, is that really the only thing that matters to me?
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that we do that for clients is we'll do an estate tax projection. And they come in and say, okay, I'm worth $100 million. Here's my assets. I'll say, great, let me do a little quick spreadsheet for you and show you under your current estate plan, here's how much estate tax would get owed. Here's how much winds up in your kids' pockets at the end of the day. Are you okay with that number? And if not, let's talk about what you would rather see happen to your wealth. And this is probably 60 to 75% of the clients are like, yeah, all I care about is reducing that estate tax number. Just get that number lower. I want more to go to my kids, my stuff. I earned it. The government doesn't deserve it. But for the other portion of the clients, they look at that and they're like, what are my two kids going to do with $50 million? I don't want that for them. I want them to have some ability to produce for themselves and that kind of stuff. And so then that conversation drastically pivots from what they came in wanting to do. So that's really the first thing, is just kind of starting with what their goals are in a bigger sense, especially goals outside of tax planning. And then after that, then it's thinking about, okay, here's what you want, mom and dad. Have you asked your kids what they want?
Yep. And
what they really envision? And some people can be really out of touch with what their kids actually want. And I'm
Yep.
sure you've seen this too. I was trying to think of an example that would apply more to regular Bay Area high net worth people as opposed to like the super uber wealthy people. And so like classic example is the timeshare. And so I've had this bunches of times where,
I hate those things.
well, we all do, but I get these stories from mom and dad every year for 40 years. We've gone to Cabo as a family. The kids love it. There's so many family memories. This is amazing. Of course, the kids are going to want this timeshare.
And they don't.
They never, ever, ever want it, notwithstanding what they might tell their parents. Oh, yes, we love those family vacations. And I'm sure they did.
Sure.
They don't the maintenance fees. They don't want to keep going back to the same stupid place every year. So they just don't want it anymore. And if there's that disconnect and you wind up in the bigger sense for what I'm doing, for me, it's maybe less the timeshare, more like the $10 million compound in Tahoe. That, well, of course the kids are going to want to co-own that together as whatever in perpetuity. No, they don't. They want the cash, right? They want to sell it, do all that. And so it's having that conversation about what the kids want, and then also a realistic conversation about what they're capable of doing. And that's really another one where I've seen where, especially in the families where they just kind of stumbled into the wealth, and the next generation just has no capabilities for dealing with complexity, no tolerance for complexity. And so if mom and dad go in and set up a family limited partnership and a bunch of dynasty trust, and they're doing all these complex transactions that are great for tax planning, But then you explain that actually you've got to open accounts for all these, you've got to file a whole pile of tax returns, you have to do the accounting for all these things. And maybe mom and dad are willing to tolerate that because they see the tax savings. But you get to the next generation, they're like, we want nothing to do with this. Give me my money and let me go off and do what I want to do.
Yep.
Right. And so you set up this whole big structure that's really efficient for estate tax, but maybe it's really inefficient if the kids are just going to sell everything at the end of the day. Right.
Yep. Yeah, there's actually a couple of books that talk about that, and I've probably mentioned one here. There's a book called The Millionaire Next Door that I've read several times, and it was written by a bunch of economists in the 1990s, and they studied, on the behest of insurance companies, they studied the behaviors of self-made wealthy individuals, and they found 7 common features among them, and one of them was whether their children are successful after them. And the reason why the children are successful is just exactly what you said. If the children are able to provide for themselves, or if they need the parents to give them what these economists call economic outpatient care, where essentially the parents will give the kids money whenever they need it. So the kids never have to learn how to be efficient. They never have to learn how to be frugal. They never have to learn how to earn more. They never have to learn skills that are actually valuable. They just kind of spend. There's another book that describes that called Complete Family Wealth. Describes generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. So generation 2 learns how to maintain the money. Generation 3 only learns how to spend it. They don't know how to earn it at all. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's interesting in the Bay Area, especially because I think what a lot of parents would want for their kids is they want them to sort of match the lifestyle that they have as parents,
Sure.
right? And so if you've got a house in Los Altos that's worth $5 million now, and you want your kids to live near you when the grandkids come around, well, now that bar is super high for those kids, right? They've got to have ability to buy a $5 million house and maintain it and live in that in Los Altos.
Yep.
Well, how much wealth do you have to get to them to meet that standard? And of course, in the whole rest of the country, that's just not the case, right? Like you can easily get your kids to a place where they can match your lifestyle without giving them millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah, I think I really like your approach. I actually take the same one, where a client comes in, they have more than some measure of exemption. They might have a taxable estate. The question is always, what are your goals? What do you want to do? I remember speaking to some clients who had about $50 million of property in Sonoma County. And I said, well, we can lower that tax value a great deal. And they said, no, we don't want to. We want to pay the government whatever they're asking for without trying to limit anything, because our kids don't need the money. And we want our kids to sell this farmland, and that's that. And I'm sure that they're dead by now because they were pretty old when I talked to them years ago. But yeah, if it's not their goal, it's not their goal. And I really appreciate the fact you are actually the first person who I've ever heard ask the question, can the kids handle the money? Because if you can't handle money, it's a curse, right? It is a total curse. If you stretch to buy a house and you can't afford it, it is a total curse. If you stretch to inherit money and you can't handle it, it is a curse, because you just can't handle it. It's going down the drain.
Yeah, it's very true. And we've seen it numerous times over the years, how that can go sideways. But even beyond that, it's like now we figured out what mom and dad's goals are. We figured out what the kids can handle. Then you have to kind of continue that conversation to guide them to the right types of options for them. And we talked a little bit about the complexity and compliance and that kind of stuff. But another aspect of it is just their tolerance for the fees that go with these things. And so I've gotten 2 situations that come up all the time. We get the call from the guy who or the girl who just started at a venture capital fund. They're straight out of business school. They think they're top of the world, and they know they're on this thing that's going to have lots of value. And they've heard from their colleagues, you got to do something. You got to do some planning with that. Get those new carried interests in your new funds, shipped it off to the kids at a low value. And so they come in and they say, okay, I need to do this thing. I need to do some carried interest planning. But oh, by the way, I still have a bunch of student loans and I don't really have any cash, so I can't really pay you very much. What's the cheap thing that I can do? You're talking different things there. Carried interest planning and cheap don't go together.
They don't.
Right. And the other one that I get all the time is the startup founder. Same scenario. I'm 23 years old. I'm sitting on this $1 billion company, but I've put 100% of everything into the company. And if I send them a bill for $2,000, they're going to say, can I put that on a credit card? right? But they know that they're on this thing and they need to do something. But again, there's just like this disconnect. And so for people in that situation, it's kind of matching up their wherewithal with, the structure that's going to be appropriate for them. Maybe for that startup founder, maybe it's just a really simple short-term crummy trust or something like that we can quickly produce and get some assets in there, rather than something more complex and long lasting at this stage. And to some degree, I like working with people like that because it can be a long-term relationship, right? You get in at the ground level and you meet these interesting people, and then they go off to do successful things. You're their advisor for a long time. So it can go really well. It can also be really difficult when they want to fight you over every bill for the stuff that you're doing. So interesting play there. The other thing that I spend a lot of time doing is sort of fighting back against other advisors. And I know you've seen this before, because I think you and I have talked about this before, where you get people that are just giving incomplete or bad advice. And then you as the attorney have to push back on that. And so where I see this a lot is with mostly financial advisors when they want to be in front of their clients with clever ideas. And so they read that article in the Wall Street Journal that's got an acronym in it, and they're like, all of my clients must do this thing with an acronym. Or even worse than that is they had one client whose attorney recommended this one thing, and now they need to tell all of their clients that they have to do this one thing. Yeah. And it never works out the way the financial advisors think it will do, the way they think it should. And so one of the things that when you have a really good team of advisors, you've got that financial advisor and the CPA, and you're all on the same team, you can have those conversations without the client in the room, right? Yep. When you've got that good relationship and that financial advisor calls you first and says, hey, we were thinking of pitching a grantor retained annuity trust to a client. And then we just have a conversation like, okay, here's the factors. You've got to beat this hurdle rate. You've got to do valuations. And maybe it makes great sense. Maybe it doesn't. But you have that conversation out of sight of the client. Yep. So you can kind of come to an agreement first, and then you present a united front to the client. Yep. The worst thing in the world is when I'm asked to be on these calls with these other advisors, and they're really pushing a structure that they've sold the client on as being the best thing since sliced bread. And I've got to be the bad guy and say, actually, that's not going to work, or actually that's way more risky than you think it is. Yep. And it takes the wind out of the sails of the financial advisor, which I don't want to do. I want to be a team player, but at the end of the day, I've got to call it like I see it. So if we can have that conversation offline, so much better.
Yep. You mentioned a couple of things, so I just want to clarify some of the terms that you talked about. So whenever you do tax planning, the tax tools are written into the IRS code. They're there. A charitable remainder annuity trust is written into the code. A grantor retained annuity trust, you must meet these certain qualifications, X, Y, Z factors. And so what Vern was talking about, and I don't mean to talk over you, correct me if I'm wrong, but what he was talking about is he's mentioning that in the code, you have certain requirements that you must meet in order to use this tool for the purposes of avoiding estate taxes. And that's fine. You can use it. But there's so many tools, and I certainly don't want to go over all the acronyms today, but we'll just say one of them, which is something that you mentioned called a crummy trust. So a crummy trust doesn't mean that it's bad. It's not crummy. It's actually named after old lady Crummy, who created a trust, and the IRS challenged her, and she sued, and she won. And so now this trust has a certain feature to allow you to gift to the trust and utilize a certain exemption that you wouldn't otherwise be allowed to do. And it's under a state of Crummy versus commission. So that's why it's called a crummy trust, because it has this one power established by the Crummy estate. So a lot of variation there. This is another good example. This happened a couple of weeks ago where I was speaking with a financial advisor on this podcast, and we started going off on banter. Vern and I can sit down and talk about a very high level tax concept and get to an understanding within about a minute and a half to 2 minutes, and then hang up the phone. Whereas if one of us were to speak to a client, it would be 2 hours of explanation. And so that's just why it's really important to have a team of advisors who know what they're doing. They understand these things. That each person works in their own personal niche.
And also, I think just being willing to be vulnerable with your other teammates, right? Yeah. If a CPA calls me up and says, hey, I don't really understand what this grantor trust thing means. I just haven't dealt with that in my practice before. I'm super happy to spend 10 minutes talking to that advisor. I'll send them some stuff from a BNA portfolio or other resources and help them out, right? I mean, I want my teammates to be well-versed on this stuff, and I'm happy to give them some freebies to just get them up to speed on stuff. And There's another interesting thought just came to mind when you were talking, when you were describing where this stuff comes from. There's two schools of thought, and I think a lot of people don't classify it this way, but it's my personal way of doing this. When it comes to tax planning, you can either say, I'm going to advise my clients to do something until there's a law that says you can't do it, or I'm going to advise my clients to do things where there's a specific law that says you can do it.
Yep.
And the aggressive people are the ones that say, I'm gonna do this thing until a court case comes out that says I can't do it. And they might have great success with that, but I couldn't sleep at night if I was doing that. I'm much more in the camp that it sounds like you're from, where if I'm doing one of these grats like you talked about, I can look up in the tax code and say, here are the 6 things you have to do to make sure that this is gonna work. And so long as you stay within these safe harbors, you're good to go.
Yep.
And I can sleep at night knowing I put my clients into something good there. And I think that's just not a universal attitude for people, but it really ought to be. Especially with the exemptions being so high, you don't need to push every edge, right? Like, you have these tools out there that are so wonderful and they're right in the tax code. There's just no need to get super creative on this stuff.
Yep. It's also very interesting that not every attorney does every job, right? So my firm only handles estates up to about 40 or 50 million. I don't go above that, but you do, right? Does your firm have a ceiling?
No practical, and like no hard ceiling. I think in practical terms, if you get to clients, we've got a handful of billionaire type clients, but they tend to be simpler people. Like, they just happen to be at the right startup at the right time, kind of a deal. But when you get to like the truly huge level, they just have needs they've got property in 15 different countries. They need all these other things going on. And so they tend to do other folks. So no real cap on the top end. And then on the bottom end, it's just kind of a practical, does it make sense to have us do something that a solo practitioner could do?
Right. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, it's kind of to the point where I remember that you and I spoke a couple of years ago when I was first starting my practice, which was, I think, 4 years ago. And we were just talking about methods and means. It seemed as though our methods were actually very similar, except for one very distinct factor. And that is that if it goes above a certain amount, I don't do it. I send it over to you.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of like just kind of beauty in that system where, if you recognize what your lane is and you just master your lane really well, that's not a horrible thing. Even like teaming up with other folks, I think can be super helpful. But it's even other estate planning attorneys. We've got engagements where maybe we come in and do a slice of the pie, but somebody else is the one who's the main estate planning contact. But we can do the family limited partnership for them or something like that, and that kind of teaming up can be just really effective for people.
Well, I want to change something to a little bit more personal here. I always ask people what's their favorite book, and I have here a couple of lists from some people. There's someone that said Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Somebody said Out of Africa. Yours is the Bible. Is that right?
Indeed, yeah.
Okay, talk about that.
But I lifelong Christian, born and raised Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and that's kind of waxed and waned over time. But it's something it's the one book that I've been able to come back to regularly and continue to get wisdom from, just in a lot of different ways, and in a lot of surprising ways too. I feel like as time goes on, you kind of get different things out of it as you go through it. And it's just kind of just a font of knowledge, right? And wisdom that you can use in conversations with clients, even if you're not quoting a specific scripture verse, but you can, just kind of have that baseline knowledge to share with people.
I absolutely love that. I read a book last month which expounds upon one proverb. It's called "As a Man Thinketh." So you could say "As a woman thinketh," but the proverb says, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." And so it expands 100 pages on this one idea. I absolutely love all the proverbs and the wisdom in the scriptures. I think it's fantastic. And just like you said, even if I don't use it for a client, at least it helps me to feel like I'm living a grounded life. And it helps me with clients as well, because as I'm helping them, I feel like my main responsibility is to help them, guide them in the right way to help their family remain whole, right? Because the worst thing that can happen is that the family fractures. And that happens far too much, far too often.
Absolutely. Yeah. And It's also kind of that just the backstop at the end of the day, right? I'm sure you've had bad days too, right? And you get that client that's yelling at you, whether deserved or not, and it's asking yourself, why am I doing this, and that kind of stuff, and being able to have that sanctuary to turn to and get some words of encouragement is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to talk too much about your personal life, but you recently moved, didn't you?
Yeah, it's been a couple of years now, but yeah, during COVID, we all got very used to doing the remote work thing, and a couple of years ago, I just decided to take that to a bit of an extreme and moved across the country. So I actually live in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area now, and still work exclusively on California clients. So I just do everything by Zoom or phone calls, and we still have offices out there, obviously. So if clients need to come in to sign documents or whatever, then they can be in a conference room with my assistant and I'm on Zoom, and we do a estate planning signing just like that. So for the most part, for my clients, it's been a huge net benefit because my clients didn't really want to drive to my office in Palo Alto or Redwood City before. So now there's no obligation. I'm not even inviting them to come to my office anymore. Everything's by Zoom. And of course, I mean, there's a few clients, they tend to be the elderly folks when there's, I need to look somebody in the eye. I need to shake a hand and that kind of stuff. And great, I can introduce you to one of my colleagues, and there you go. But yeah, so I've been fully remote now for a couple of years. It's quite a lifestyle change.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been working out well so far.
That's good. I'm glad to hear it. Glad. Vern and I once served on the board of a local nonprofit. Attorneys have bar associations. It's an association of attorneys that's focused on education and advocacy to help attorneys be better. And so we served together on the board of a local bar association. And Vern had a very impressive beard at that time. It was huge. It was a beautiful, big, bushy beard. I think once I called you Elijah the Prophet.
Yep, I do remember that. Yeah, I still have some pictures. I think it was right around like Christmas time of 2020, like the worst COVID year, and it was like full on Santa Claus. It was It was nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Vern, if people want to find you, how do they look you up?
Sure. To hopkinsandcarly.com, always a good place to get in touch with me or my colleagues. You can feel free to email me, vadkins@hopkinscarly.com. And yeah, always happy to just bounce an idea off. If you're not sure if the stuff that we offer is right for you, happy to have a quick conversation and see if we're a good fit to help you out.
Something that's important to know is that Vern is an estate planner attorney just like me, right? I'm an estate planner and he's an estate planner, but we do different things, right? And so our practices very rarely cross over. And so I'm not really in competition with Vern. He's not really in competition with me. He generally doesn't do single family trusts. I generally do not represent clients more than 30 million. So there's really very little competition, but that's great. And that's good. Vern, it's great to talk to you. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything that you'd like to leave?
Think ahead is the main message that we want clients to think about right now. Clients tend to wait until the last possible second before they start doing stuff. And if you're sitting there in December 2025 and the tax law is going to change in 2 weeks, it's way too late to do anything. So if you're in that situation and you need to start thinking about it, think about it this year, not next year.
The number of attorneys that understand and do tax planning are very few and far between. And the ones that are really good at it are even more rare. And so, the best attorneys are already filling up their schedules for the end of 2020. I know I am. I have 2 months where I'm not taking any clients just because we're already full, right? So, you have to get in early if you want to. If you want, you need to make the appointment, set the appointment. There are several good firms. If you contact me or you contact Vern and it doesn't work where we're full, we're just going to send you to someone that's good. They generally don't send referrals to people who are bad. If they do a bad job, I don't send it again. So, yeah, Vern's a good.
All right, I appreciate that, Elijah.
Well, we're going to close up shop then. I want to thank everybody for listening in to the Keys to Your Legacy. You can find our podcast on any major platform. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Let us know in the comments what you'd like to hear from next. And thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to follow along to establish the Keys to Your Legacy. Thanks so much.
You've been tuning into The Keys to Your Legacy with your host, Elijah Keys. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, keyslawgroup.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.